Hello, and thank you for tuning in. As I'm recording this in January 2023, the Hollywood Awards season and the film festival circuit is getting underway, including Sundance. This is a perfect time to talk about how movies are made, documentaries in particular. One documentary that's getting a lot of buzz on the festival circuit is called Subject. The documentary is about the ethical dilemmas that documentaries themselves pose and how they impact the people who are featured in them. As a documentary filmmaker myself, I find this subject, no pun intended, fascinating. I explore these issues and more in this conversation with Camilla Hall, who co-directed the subject documentary with Jennifer Tiexiera. My apologies if I mispronounced Jennifer's last name. Without further ado, here's my conversation with documentary filmmaker Camilla Hall.
Okay to drink my cup of tea.
Absolutely. Do whatever
Okay,
makes you feel
brilliant.
comfortable.
I am English, so I can drink tea on enemies.
Of course. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, how did you what made you want to explore the issues in subject, and how did the project come about?
Yeah, so I think for both Jen and I, we came at it from slightly different angles. So Jen had been an editor for, more than a decade and had been really kind of in control of telling people stories that almost she'd never met until the films were finished. So that was something that had always kind of played on her mind. And as she became a director, I think that that was an area that she was kind of really interested in. And then for me, I came to documentary filmmaking from journalism, and I kind of came from the newsroom. I was at the Financial Times before I was a filmmaker, and there were very structured rules around engaging interviewees, around all of those kind of moral and ethical issues. And you also had a big structure above you, so you would have editors, you'd have managing editors, you'd have HR managers, and kind of when I started in documentary, I really, especially independent filmmaking, I was just really shocked at the kind of lack of structure and like the lack of basic guidelines that anyone was following. And so I really wanted to try to explore and understand what it was like to be on the other side of the camera. And certainly in the past, I've made documentaries about trauma and about very difficult issues, and I have seen people struggling when I've been working with them on a documentary. And I think, now I'm kind of later in my career, I really wanted to go back and kind of try to understand more about what that experience had been like for those people.
Right, right. Our backgrounds are pretty similar because I started out in journalism as well, working at
Cool.
newspapers. So
Oh,
yeah, so I
awesome.
just what are some of the main points that you want people who see subject to kind of take away?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to both Jen and I is that the film is not, it's not just for filmmakers. It's really a film for audiences of documentaries. And so many people are watching documentaries and docuseries at the moment, and even fiction series that are based on real people's lives. So what we really want to do is just have people just like think for a second when they're watching a documentary about like what they're actually consuming, and that this is really about a real person and their real lives. And that could be, the latest Dharma fiction show that's based on real life stories, or it could be, a documentary feature or a documentary series. But I think it's just that idea that this is a real person's life, and just like make sure you understand that and just think about that, in terms of how much of that kind of trauma and crime and kind of negative storytelling you're actually consuming.
Right, right. I thought it was interesting. It was interesting how the one participant from Hoop Dreams talked about how the filmmakers eventually kind of struck a revenue sharing deal,
Yeah.
and how it was life changing money for him and his family, life changing in a good way. And so I had raised the point of documentaries about people like Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby who are accused of sexual abuse. What is a fair way to compensate the participants in those documentaries when, number one, they've already been through trauma, and number two, they're already like people, not only people in power, but just everyday observers who are reluctant to believe their stories? How do you compensate them without taking away from the credibility of their experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really, really great question. And I think it's been really clear from kind of day one that there's like no one size fits all when it comes to documentary. The first kind of the starting point is really reflection, which is kind of part of the documentary accountability working group's framework as well. It's that first phase of kind of reflection. And it's really the first thing is to ask yourself these questions, like the fact that you're asking yourself, how do I make this person feel like they've been valued as part of this process? And in some circumstances, that's going to be financial compensation. In others, it may be, extremely solid mental health support that kind of continues through the project and goes on after the project. And that can actually, be equivalent to a lot of money. It could be that if somebody is providing archive to the project, that's a way that it can easily be contracted to pay somebody for their footage or their materials. But I think that there are situations where, especially when there's a legal case involved, where I think that payment specifically can be really challenging. So it's definitely not a one size fits all. There are certainly instances still where payment may not be the right solution. But I think as a filmmaker, you have to think through, like, what are the needs of this person? And ultimately, it just comes down to, like, am I acting in an exploitative way? It's not
Right.
just like how much should this person be paid. It's like, what am I doing that could be exploitative towards this person and their story? And then kind of starting from there and trying to kind of work backwards.
Right. And do you think because, especially a lot of documentaries are made independently, that in the cases where it is appropriate to offer some kind of financial participation to the participants, that revenue sharing is a good way to go, especially if, you're an indie filmmaker and you don't have, thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars at your disposal to say, here, I'll pay you this for your story, like a big publisher would if they were writing a memoir or something.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think, we have to be realistic about what resources we have. And I think, a profit share, if people get rich off the project, then, why shouldn't the participants be a part of that? It's their story. At the end of the day, though, I think even doing that, it's really important to be able to have those conversations with your participants to say, it's very unusual for a documentary to make profit. Like, this is a token of my gratitude to your contribution, but realistically, the chances of this turning into money is actually pretty low. And I think you have to be really honest with that from day one. And maybe the more experience you get in the field, the more you realize that profit is pretty hard to come by. So it's more of in a sense, it's just more of a token of gratitude for
Mm-hmm.
the fact that they are a partner and a shared partner in the process of making the project.
Right. And I mean, you see that with indie filmmakers who work with actors who, they say, well, I can't pay you a lot up front, but I'll, give you quote unquote points on the movie that if it does turn a profit, you can, you'll be compensated for your work and for your time.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's quite challenging too, because it's also kind of one of the hardest questions that we kind of pose in the film is like, should all these films get made?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really interesting question, because if you're embarking on a project and you knowingly don't have the resources to cover certain things like mental health for the participants, you know that's a question we face a lot of the times. Well, I don't have the funding to pay for that. Well, is it the right time to make that project? And I think that, as filmmakers, I think that we're going to have to become really tough on ourselves to ask, like, does this film need to get made, or do I just feel like I need to make a film? And I think what's important in that conversation, it's so complex, but what's an important part of that conversation is making sure that funding is reaching filmmakers of color and filmmakers who are not of large economic means, because then the barrier to entry just becomes impossible. So I think that there's so many layers to this, but ultimately, we need to be making films where the funding is in place to provide the support that participants need, but at the same time, we need to level the playing field in terms of funding so that the voices who can tell those stories are not just white and wealthy.
Yeah, and I've never done a crowdfunding campaign. I don't know if you have, but what is your sense of, if you included in a crowdfunding campaign mental health resources for the participants involved? Do you think maybe people would be open to supporting that as, donating toward or contributing toward the production?
I mean, so far I haven't tried it through crowdfunding, but I have
Mhm.
tried it with different institutions and that support documentary. And definitely it's been an area that actually they want to support above anything else. It's
Mhm.
it's actually something that is really kind of on the radar at the moment and something that people want to be involved with and have associated with their projects. In terms of individuals, I think I mean, I think it would be successful. I mean, I think crowdfunding in general is just extremely hard. It takes a huge amount of work, which I think people don't necessarily realize on behalf of the person fundraising. An extraordinary amount of work and social media to even to try to get a thousand or a few $1,000s. But I think if you show that you're trying to be an ethical filmmaker, I think that can only really go in your favor.
Right. How did you go about finding and I like how you use the term participants rather than subjects. How did you go about finding the participants for subject? And did you have to sort of, I hate to use the term, talk them into it, but did you have to overcome any reluctance for them to participate?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, the word participants it was kind of an interesting journey because we actually workshopped with the participant co-producers on the film to really discuss like what would be our language kind of going forward. And we talked through different words like protagonist or collaborator or contributor. And the word subject was just really profoundly rejected by everybody. They all felt like it kind of objectified them and they felt very uncomfortable with it. So we've actually, as part of our kind of process and campaign, we have been actively educating people, whether it's film festivals or PR people, people that kind of come into contact with us as we're kind of getting the film out into the world. We're trying to also kind of share that this is the word that we want to use, which is participant, which has come from our participant co-producers. But in terms of reaching out to them, it really, Jen and I often talk about it as a kind of a love letter to our
Mhm.
industry. Like these were films that had like profoundly touched us in some way. Like either we found ourselves watching them and just couldn't stop, or just, fascinated years after watching them. I think for Jen, Hoop Dreams was one of the films that really made her want to make documentaries. And for me, Capturing the Freedmans was that in some ways. It was just the first time I'd seen the truth kind of presented in this extremely complex way. And I just my whole kind of brain exploded. And I was like, what is this? It's just really fascinating and engaging. So it started with the films that we loved, and in that sense, it wasn't so scientific. I think we were very interested in the true crime genre because that's obviously just exploded so much. And we knew that we really wanted an international film, and The Square was a film that I'd loved for a long time, and I spent a lot of time in Egypt, so I just had a lot of connection to that film. And Ahmed was just so magnetic once we got in touch with him. So yeah, initially the whole project started with Margie from the Staircase. So we met Margie in a cafe. It was a very random introduction. I'd been thinking about this idea for a while, and then out of the blue, I got an email in my inbox saying, "Would you be okay to meet with Margie? She's interested in joining, in like starting to really move into the documentary filmmaking space. She's studied filmmaking. She's been in these different roles for a while, and now she wants to really go into producing. Would you give her some advice?" And I was like, "Oh my god, this is like the universe is like telling me like this movie needs to get made." So I went and sat with her for a coffee, and yeah, basically told her the idea, and she was just like, "Oh my god, I never thought I'd be in a documentary ever again, but this is one that like I think is really important, and I want to be a part of it." And then Margie was pretty central in kind of reaching out to Jesse. I think Margie's involvement in the project gave Jesse a lot of reassurance that like we were serious and like we weren't just trying to do like a Capturing the Freedmans 2 or like a sequel, like that we really had this quite kind of cerebral concept that we were trying to explore. And then from there, yeah, we kind of found different ways of contacting. I think with Ahmed, I reached out directly on social media. With Mukunda, we had a shared friend. But we did make the decision not to contact the participants via the original directors of the films. And that was based on wanting them to feel agency over the decision. And then later on in the project, when we got to rough cut stage, we actually workshopped the film with those original directors.
Yeah, and that was something I thought was really interesting because as a journalist that it would be very I don't know if unusual is the word, but you wouldn't show a copy of your story to the interview subject. There goes that word, subject. You wouldn't show a copy of your story to people. You might call them and ask clarifying questions or say, hey, let me run these facts by you just to make, you would do fact checking, but a lot of times it's frowned on in journalism to let somebody read your story, a source read your story, because of course they're going to want to change things to make themselves look, be presented in the most favorable light. So can you kind of talk about that process of workshopping the movie with the participants and the previous
Yeah.
directors?
So, I mean, it was the most incredibly engaged edit in that sense. And I think the fact that, my co-director, Jen, does have a background in editing, like allowed us really to continue that process right up until the last minute, because we were able to do new deliveries like all the way through. So the process really started with the co-producer participants. So they all watched the cut of the film and then they gave kind of their thoughts and feedback on their sections. And then after that process, it went to the experts in the film. So everybody else that was kind of on camera who had the opportunity to weigh in and give their thoughts. Turns out they're also, some of the top voices in our industry. So that was also really helpful in terms of shaping the film, as was the input of the participant co-producers. And then after that, the final step was workshopping with the original directors. So yeah, I mean, it was different levels of engagement just based on kind of we really let each director kind of lead that. So some directors were like much more engaged than others, and some it was just like some basic fact checking, and some of it was like much more how the story was represented, and we workshopped that with them. But I think Jen's kind of experience as an editor, she just brought this openness to receiving feedback. And I think like as directors, we have this kind of initial kind of almost like we have to defend ourselves against like every note that's presented. And I think Jen really kind of taught me the value of just like not taking that as your initial standing point, but actually just sitting back, really hearing out the person and what they were saying. And more often than not, that was, that those comments were things that strengthened the film. And so I think we just approached it with a really open mind and without fear. And I think the result, was really strong. But at the end of the day, like, people need to be able to stand by like what if you're making a documentary and that is going to be in perpetuity in the universe forever and ever, people need to be able to stand by what is shown on the screen. So, again, there's no one size fits all. It may not be possible with every documentary, but with this documentary, it definitely fit the mold.
And it sounds like that no one had an extreme negative reaction, like if you don't change X, Y, and Z, I'm going to sue, or demand that you cut me out
Nothing.
of
We
the
had
movie.
like no legal threats in that regard
Mm-hmm.
at all. No threats to pull out of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, nothing, literally like nothing dramatic at all. I would say, yeah, nothing. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
and
and I
it,
think a
and
lot of, again, I think that's a lot of the that kind of those kind of things happen, I think, when people feel closed out of the process. And I actually think while this is a lot of work to do like what we did, it can actually prevent a lot of drama and difficulties that will take up a lot of your time and actually could potentially damage like the future of the movie. So yeah, it's kind of like putting in the work earlier and like being more trusting, and then I think the results actually can be a lot smoother in the end.
Right. Since everyone basically has a camera in their pocket via their phone these days, pretty much is everyone a documentarian. And I think you had said that because of that, the film industry is pushing for, more and more advanced technology like 10K resolution. Can you kind of expound on that? Will there
Yeah.
be more pressure to
I mean, this will
use
be
more
one of the
advanced?
videos that like in 5 years time be like, oh my God, she was so wrong. No, I guess what I was saying is, there is this obvious democratization of filmmaking, of documentary filmmaking and fiction through, iPhone cameras and just essentially the technology of camera phones just getting stronger and stronger. I think you can already shoot 4K through a phone. But yeah, I was just saying, on the other hand, there is this movement, certainly in LA and in Hollywood, where the big camera technology is also just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, in documentary, we were, shooting 1080, and then now, often streamers will, they will request like 4K. So they're starting to screen films in 4K in the future. So essentially we're being pushed to kind of increase the resolution, and the camera companies and the industry in Hollywood is just constantly increasing the resolution on cameras. So we definitely have 10K. I'm not an expert. There may be even higher than that by now. But I would say the kind of the democratization of documentary is also forcing like a premium on documentaries that look and feel like they've been shot with a lot of money, basically. That's what I see. But I think that we're going to see some amazing. I think new voices can come through on incredible stories with the iPhone, and I think that's fantastic. And I think there's a small part of the industry that will keep pushing into these like very premium, expensive levels. But I'm hoping that the stories start to break through that we haven't been seeing.
Yeah, and it sounds like it could create some inequities. This focus on advanced technology, like if you shoot your movie on an iPhone, no matter how technically um, advanced it looks, because the streamer knows you shot it on an iPhone, they're going to reject it. But you could therefore put it on YouTube or Vimeo, or just release it in chunks on social media. So you may have to, as a filmmaker, find creative ways to release it rather than relying on traditional distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be those films that break through.
Mm-hmm.
Like Tangerine was one of the first, fiction films shot on an iPhone, and that became like part of its like selling point. And I think that there's always going to be those ones that kind of stand up and show through. And yeah, probably in the near future we will see a lot more kind of documentaries and fiction shot on iPhone. I know Steven Soderbergh has shot on iPhone as well, but we're just not quite there yet in terms of it being fully accepted as a camera format.
Right, right. So if people want to see subject and kind of get involved in the cause and the issues raised in the movie, what's the best way to go about that?
So yeah, I mean, the first place is socials. So we're at Subject Documentary. You can find us on Instagram, I guess, as well. We're most active. And then our website is subjectdocumentary.film. And all of our upcoming screenings are on there. At the moment, we are on the festival circuit. So we are showing the film pretty much all over America. So the next screenings we have coming up are in Los Angeles, Palm Springs. I mean, I literally lose count. There's like cities all over America. So that's like seeing it in the theater is the first step, and then I'm sure next year it will be available on platforms and online. But yeah, I would check out the website, check out the socials, and follow the story. And if you are a documentary participant, we'd love to hear from you.
Was there anything I didn't ask about in regard to subject or upcoming projects or anything else that you'd like to mention?
No, I think that was a great interview. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Camilla. If you like this video, please leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to my channel.